Part 1, Chapter 14 of the Story of the Barbary Corsairs by Stanley Lane-Poole. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White. Chapter 14 Lepanto, 1571. The failure of the siege of Malta was a sensible rebuff, yet it cannot be said that it seriously injured the renown of the Turks in the Mediterranean. They had been resisted on land. They had not yet been beaten at sea. Nor could they look back on the terrible months of the siege without some compensating feeling of consolation. They had taken St. Elmo, and its fall had aroused general jubilation in every Moslem breast. The Moors of Granada went near to rising against the Spaniards on the mere report of this triumph of the Turkish arms. Though they had failed to reduce St. Michael, the cause was to be found, at least in part, in a false alarm and an unreasoning panic. To be defeated by such warriors as the Knights of St. John was not a disgrace. Like the Highlanders in the Crimean War, these men were not so much soldiers in their opponents' eyes as veritable devils. And who shall contend against the legions of the Jinn? Moreover, forced as they were to abandon the siege, had they not left the island a desert, its people reduced by half, its fortifications heaps of rubbish, its brave defenders a handful of invalids? So reasoned the Turks, and prepared for another campaign. They had lost many men, but more were ready to take their place. Their immense fleet was uninjured, and though Dragut was no more, Ochiali, as the Christians called Ali el Uluji, the renegade, the Turks dubbed him Fartis, scurvied, from his complaint, was following successfully in his old master's steps. Born at Castelli, Licastoli, in Calabria about 1508, Ochiali was to have been a priest, but his capture by the Turks turned him to the more exciting career of a corsair. Soon after the siege of Malta he succeeded Barbarossa's son Hassan as Pasha, or Beglerbeg of Algiers, 1568, and one of his first acts was to retake Tunis, all but the Goletta, in the name of Sultan Salim II, who, to the unspeakable loss of the Mohammedan world, had in 1566 succeeded his great father Suleiman. In July 1570, off Alicata, on the southern coast of Sicily, Ochiali surrounded 4 galleys of the religion (they then possessed but 5), and took 3 of them, including the flagship, which Saint Clément, the general of the galleys, abandoned in order to throw himself and his treasure on shore at Montichiaro. 1 galley alone, the St. Anne, made a desperate resistance. The others surrendered. 60 knights, or serving brothers of the order, were killed or made prisoners on this disastrous day, and so intense was the indignation in Malta that the Grand Master had much ado to save Saint Clément from being lynched by the mob, and was obliged to deliver him up to the secular court, which at once condemned him to death. He was strangled in his cell, and his body thrown in a sack into the sea. Such a success went far to atone for Mustafa Pasha's unfortunate siege. A far more important triumph awaited the Turks in 1570–71, a siege and a conquest. The new Sultan, like his father, saw in the island of Cyprus a standing affront to his authority in the Levant. Then, as now, Cyprus was a vital centre in all maritime wars in the eastern Mediterranean, a convenient depot for troops and stores, a watchtower whence the movements of the Turkish fleet could be observed, a refuge for the numberless Christian Corsairs that infested the coast of Syria. Cyprus belonged to Venice, and on the score of her protection of piracy the Sultan found no difficulty in picking a quarrel with the Senate. War was declared, and Piali Pasha transported a large army under Lala Mustafa, not the Seraskier, who commanded at Malta, to lay siege to Nicosia, the capital of the island. After 48 days the city fell, September 9th, and became a shambles. The catastrophe might have been averted had the Christian fleet owned a single competent chief, but unhappily the relief of Cyprus was entrusted to the least trustworthy of all instruments, a coalition. Pope Pius V, a man of austere piety, full of the zeal of his high office, and in energy and intellect a born leader, spared no effort to support the Venetians as soon as war became inevitable. Few of the states of Europe found it convenient to respond to his appeal, but Philip of Spain sent a numerous fleet under Giovanni Andrea Doria, and the Pope himself, aided in some degree by the Italian princes, added an important contingent, which he confided to the care of the Grand Constable of Naples, Mark Antony Colonna. Giovanni Zane commanded the Venetian fleet. The whole force, when united, amounted to no less than 206 vessels, of which 11 were galleasses, and nearly all the rest galleys, while the soldiers and crews numbered 48,000 men. So dire was the dread then inspired by the Turks, that this vast armament dared not move till it was known that Ochiali had left the neighbourhood of Italy, and even then the rivalries of the different admirals tended rather to war between the contingents than an attack upon the enemy's fleet. While the Christians were wrangling, and Doria was displaying the same Fabian caution that had led his grand uncle to lose the battle of Prevesa, Piali Pasha, wholly regardless of danger, had bared his galleys almost entirely of soldiers, in order to aid Lala Mustafa in the final assault on Nicosia. Had the allied fleets attacked him on the 8th or 9th of September, it is doubtful whether a single Turkish galley could have shown fight. But Colonna and Doria wasted their time in wrangling and discussing, while the foe lay powerless at their feet. Finally they sailed back to Sicily for fear of bad weather. Such were the admirals who furnished the jibes of Ochiali and his brother Corsairs. Famagusta surrendered August 4, 1571, and despite the promise of life and liberty, the garrison was massacred, and the Venetian commander, Bragadino, cruelly burnt to death. Cyprus became a Turkish possession thenceforward to this day. Meanwhile the Turkish and Barbary fleets, commanded by Ali Pasha, the successor of Piali and Ochiali, ravaged Crete and other islands, and coasting up the Adriatic, worked their will upon every town or village it suited their pleasure to attack. Thousands of prisoners and stores and booty of every description rewarded their industry. At length, in September, they anchored in the Gulf of Lepanto. They had heard that the united Christian fleets were on the move, and nothing would suit the victors of Cyprus better than a round encounter with the enemy. Flushed with success, they had no fear for the issue. Many a Christian fleet had gathered its members together before then in the waters of the Adriatic. The great battle off Prevesa was in the memory of many an old sailor as the galleys came to the rendezvous in the autumn of 1571. But there was an essential difference between then and now. Prevesa was lost by divided counsels. At Lepanto there was but one commander-in-chief. Pope Pius V had labored unceasingly at the task of uniting the allies and smoothing away jealousies, and he had succeeded in drawing the navies of southern Europe on to another year's campaign. Then, warned by what he had learned of the wranglings off Cyprus, he exerted his prerogative as Vicar of God, and named as the sole commander-in-chief of the whole fleet, Don John of Austria. Son of the most illustrious monarch of the age, Don John was born to greatness. His mother was the beautiful singer Barba Blomberg. His father was Charles V. The one gave him grace and beauty, the other the genius of command. He was but 22 when his half-brother Philip confided to him the difficult task of suppressing the rebellion of the Moors in the Alpuxarras. Where the experienced veterans of Spain had failed, the beardless general of 22 succeeded to admiration. And now, 2 years later, he was called to the command of the whole navy of southern Europe. He accepted the post with joy. He had all the hopeful confidence of youth, and he longed to fight one of the world's great battles. His enthusiasm glowed in his face. One sees it in his portraits and on the medals struck to commemorate his victory. Beau comme un Napoléon, il avait tout le prestige d'un archange envoyé par le Seigneur pour exterminer les ennemis de la foi. Squadron after squadron begins to crowd the Straits of Messina. Veniero, the Venetian admiral, is already there with 48 galleys, and 60 more expected, when Colonna enters in July with 18 vessels and Moors alongside. Don John has not arrived yet. he has had much ado to get his squadron ready, for no nation understands better than the Spanish the virtue of the adage festina lente. At last he puts off from Barcelona, and laboriously crosses the Gulf of Lyons. One may smile now at the transit, but in those days, what with the Mistral and the risk of Corsairs, to cross the Gulf of Lyons was a thing to be thought about. At Genoa, Don John is entertained by Giovanni Andrea Doria, and attends a fancy ball in a gay humour that becomes his youth and buoyancy, with all his perils still ahead. As he proceeds, he hears how the Turks are laying waste Dalmatia, and how the allies are quarrelling at Messina, but he hastens not. He knows that a galley on a long voyage has as much a fixed pace as a horse, and that flogging is of no use except for a short course. At Naples he reverently receives the standard, blessed by His Holiness himself, and on August 23rd he joins the fleet at Messina. Time is still needed for the other ships to come up, and for the commander-in-chief to mature his plans. Before they start, each captain of a galley will have a separate written order, showing him his place during the voyage and his post in any engagement, whereby the risk of confusion and hasty marshalling is almost done away. On the 16th of September the signal is given to weigh anchor. Don John is off first in his Real, a splendid Capitana galley of 60 oars, with a poop carved with allegorical designs by Vasquez de Seville. After him come 285 vessels, comprising 6 galleasses and 209 galleys, carrying 29,000 men, and commanded by the most famous names of the great families of Spain, Genoa, Venice, Naples, Rome, Vicenza, Padua, Savoy, and Sicily. Don Juan de Cardona leads the van with 7 galleys. Don John himself, between Marcantonio Colonna and Veniero, commands the centre of 62 large galleys. Giovanni Andrea Doria has 50 in the right wing, Barbarigo of Venice 53 in the left. Don Alvaro de Bazan commands the reserve of 30 galleys. The galleasses are ranged before the lines, each with 500 arquebusiers on board. After 10 days' rowing and sailing they reach Corfu, and the castle greets them with thunders of joy guns, for the fear of the Turk is removed. Ali Pasha, hard by in the Gulf of Lepanto, sent out scouts to ascertain the enemy's strength. A bold Barbary Corsair pushed his bark unseen by night among the Christian galleys, but his report was imperfect. Until the day of conflict neither side knew the exact strength of his opponent. The Turkish fleet numbered about 208 galleys and 66 galleots, and carried 25,000 men. Constantinople furnished 95 galleys, 21 came from Alexandria, 25 from Anatolia, 10 from Rhodes, 10 from Mytilene, 9 from Syria, 12 from Napoli di Romagna, 13 from the Negropont, and 11 from Algiers and Tripoli. The galleots were chiefly Barbary vessels, more useful for piracy than a set battle. The two fleets unexpectedly came in sight of each other at 7 o'clock on the morning of October 7th, at a point just south of the Echinades, and between Ithaca and the Gulf of Patras or Lepanto. A white sail or two on the horizon was descried by Don John's lookout on the maintop. Then sail after sail rose above the sea line, and the enemy came into full view. Don John quickly ran up a white flag, the signal of battle, and immediately the whole fleet was busily engaged in clewing up the sails to the yards, and making all snug for the conflict. The central banks were removed to make room for the soldiers, and the slaves were served with meat and wine. Old seamen, who had met the Turks again and again from their youth up, prepared grimly for revenge. Sanguine boys who held arms in set fight for the first time that day looked forward eagerly to the moment of action. Even to the last, the incurable vacillation of the allied admirals was felt. They suggested a council of war. Don John's reply was worthy of him. "The time for councils is past," he said. "Do not trouble yourselves about aught but fighting." Then he entered his gig and went from galley to galley, passing under each stern, crucifix in hand, encouraging the men. His calm and confident mien and the charm of his address excited universal enthusiasm, and he was met on all hands with the response, "Ready, sir, and the sooner the better." Then Don John unfurled the blessed standard with the figure of the Saviour, and falling on his knees, commended his cause to God. About 11 o'clock a dead calm set in. The Turks shortened sail and took to their oars. In perfect order, and with matchless speed and precision, they formed in line of battle, while drums and fifes announced their high spirits. The Christian fleet was slower in falling into line. Some of the galleys and most of the galleasses were behindhand. Don John let drop some pious oaths, and sent swift vessels to hurry them up. At last they began to get into order. Barbarigo, the left guide, hugged the coast with the left wing. Don John, with the centre corps de bataille, kept touch with him, but where was the right guide? Giovanni Doria, infected with the tactical vanity of his family, resolved to show these landsmen how a sailor can manoeuvre. Conceiving that Ochiali, on the Ottoman left, was trying to outflank the Christian fleet, he bore out to sea in order to turn him. In vain Don John sent to recall him. He had gone out of reach, and the battle had to be fought without the right wing. Doria's precious manoeuvring went near to losing the day. The Ottoman fleet was marshalled in the same order as the Christian, except that there were no galleasses. The line of battle, nearly a mile long, was divided into centre and right and left wing, and behind the centre was the reserve. Mohammed Shaluk, called by the Europeans Shirako, commanded the right wing, opposed to Barbarigo's left. Ali Pasha opposed Don John in the centre. Ochiali was over against the post where Doria should have been. Between the two lines stood forth the heavy galleasses, like great breakwaters, turning aside and dividing the flowing rush of the Ottoman galleys. The fire of these huge floating castles nearly caused a panic among the Turks, but they soon pulled past them, and a general mêlée ensued. In the Christian left, after a deadly struggle in which both Barbarigo and Shirako lost their lives, the Turks were repulsed, and deprived of their chief, took to the shore, but not before the Christians had lost many galleys and a host of brave men. Soon after the left had been engaged, the centre came into action. Ali Pasha made straight for Don John's Real, and his beak rammed it as far in as the fourth bank of oars. Close by were Pertev Pasha and the capitanas of Colonna and Viniero. The ships became entangled and formed one large platform of war. Twice the Spaniards of the Real boarded the fanal of Ali Pasha as far as the mainmast, and twice they were driven back with terrible loss. Ali himself was preparing to leap upon Don John's galley when Colonna rammed him on the poop, penetrating as far as the third oar, and delivered a withering fire from his arquebuses. The Christians had all the advantage of armour and firearms, and fired behind bulwarks. The Turks were unprotected by cuirass or helmet or bulwark, and most of them had bows instead of guns. Colonna's volleys decided the fate of the fanal, and Ali Pasha departed this life. An hour and a half had sufficed to disperse the Ottoman right, and to overpower the flagship in chief. When the fleet saw the Christian ensign at the peak of the Turkish capitana, they redoubled their efforts. Viniero, severely wounded, still fought with the Seraskier Pertev Pasha. The Turks fled, and Pertev took to the land. In half an hour more Don John's centre was completely victorious. Then a new danger arose. Ochiali, seeing that Doria was well away to sea, sharply doubled back with all the right wing, and bore down upon the exhausted centre. He rushed upon the capitana of Malta, and massacred every soul on board. Dragut was avenged. Juan de Cardona hastened to the rescue, and of his 500 soldiers but 50 escaped. On the Fiorenza 17 men alone remained alive, and other terrible losses were incurred in the furious encounter. Upon this the ingenious Doria perceived that he had outwitted only his own cause, and at last turned back. The Marquis de Santa Cruz was already upon the enemy. Don John was after him with 20 galleys. Ochiali was outnumbered, and after a brilliant effort, made off in all haste for Santa Maura. bearing with him the standard of the religion, to be hung up in St. Sophia. The battle of Lepanto is fought and won. The Turks have been utterly vanquished. Well might the good Pope cry, as the preacher cried in St. Stephen's a century later when Sobieski saved Vienna, "There was a man sent from God, whose name was John." The Turkish fleet was almost annihilate. 190 galleys were captured, besides galleots, and 15 more burnt or sunk. Probably 20,000 men had perished, including an appalling list of high dignitaries from all parts of the empire. The Christians lost 7,500 men, including many of the most illustrious houses of Italy and Spain. Cervantes, who commanded a company of soldiers on board the Marquesa, fortunately escaped with a wound in his left arm, and to many the battle of Lepanto is familiar only from the magical pages of Don Quixote. 17 Venetian commanders were dead, and among them Vincenzo Quirini and the valiant, chivalrous, and venerable Proveditore Barbarigo. 60 knights of the diminished order of St. John had given up the ghost. 12,000 Christian slaves were freed from the Ottoman galleys. The brilliant young conqueror did not wear his well-earned laurels long. His statue was erected at Messina. His victory was the subject of Tintoret and Titian. He was received with ovations wherever he went. 2 years later he recaptured Tunis. Then he was employed in the melancholy task of carrying on Alva's detestable work in Flanders. He inflicted a sanguinary defeat upon the Dutch at Gembloux, and then, struck down by fever, the young hero died on October 1, 1578, in his 31st year, the last of the great figures of medieval chivalry. A knight worthy to have been commemorated in the Charlemagne jest, and to have sat at Arthur's Round Table with Sir Galahad himself. End of Part 1, Chapter 14. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.